The Secret Garden by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 11. The Nest of the Missel Thrush. For 2 or 3 minutes he stood looking round him, while Mary watched him, and then he began to walk about softly, even more lightly than Mary had walked the first time she had found herself inside the four walls. His eyes seemed to be taking in everything: the grey trees with the grey creepers climbing over them and hanging from their branches, the tangle on the walls and among the grass, the evergreen alcoves with the stone seats and tall flower urns standing in them. I never thought I'd see this place, he said at last, in a whisper. Did you know about it? Asked Mary. She had spoken aloud and he made a sign to her. We must talk low, he said, or someone'll hear us and wonder what's to do in here. Oh, I forgot, said Mary, feeling frightened and putting her hand quickly against her mouth. Did you know about the garden? She asked again when she had recovered herself. Dicko nodded. Martha told me there was one as no one ever went inside, he answered. Us used to wonder what it was like. He stopped and looked round at the lovely grey tangle about him, and his round eyes looked queerly happy. Eh? The nests as'll be here come springtime, he said. It would be Ed's safest nestin' place in England. No one never coming near and tangles o' trees and roses to build in. I wonder all Eth birds on Eth more don't build here. Mistress Mary put her hand on his arm again without knowing it. Will there be roses? She whispered. Can you tell? I thought perhaps they were all dead. Eh? No. Not them, not all of them, he answered. Look here. He stepped over to the nearest tree, an old one with grey lichen all over its bark, but upholding a curtain of tangled sprays and branches. He took a thick knife out of his pocket and opened one of its blades. There's lots o' dead wood as ought to be cut out, he said. And there's a lot o' old wood, but it made some new last year. This here's a new bit, and he touched a shoot which looked brownish green instead of hard, dry grey. Mary touched it herself in an eager, reverent way. That one, she said. Is that one quite alive quite? Dicko curved his wide smiling mouth. It's as big as you or me, he said, and Mary remembered that Martha had told her that Wick meant alive or lively. I'm glad it's Wick, she cried out in her whisper. I want them all to be Wick. Let us go round the garden and count how many Wick ones there are. She quite panted with eagerness, and Dicko was as eager as she was. They went from tree to tree and from bush to bush. Dicko carried his knife in his hand and showed her things which she thought wonderful. They've run wild, he said, but Ed's strongest ones has fair thrived on it. The delicatest ones has died out, but Eth others has growed and spread, till they's a wonder. See here, and he pulled down a thick grey, dry-looking branch. A body might think this was dead wood, but I don't believe it is, down to Eth root. I'll cut it low down and see. He knelt and with his knife cut the lifeless-looking branch through, not far above the earth. There, he said exultantly. I told thee so. There's green in that wood yet. Look at it. Mary was down on her knees before he spoke, gazing with all her might. When it looks a bit greenish and juicy like that, it's wick, he explained. When Eth inside is dry and breaks easy, like this here piece I've cut off, it's done for. There's a big root here as all this live wood sprung out of, and if Eth old wood's cut off and it's dug round, and took care of there'll be. He stopped and lifted his face to look up at the climbing and hanging sprays above him, There'll be a fountain or roses here this summer. They went from bush to bush and from tree to tree. He was very strong and clever with his knife and knew how to cut the dry and dead wood away, and could tell when an unpromising bough or twig had still green life in it. In the course of half an hour, Mary thought she could tell too, and when he cut through a lifeless looking branch, she would cry out joyfully under her breath when she caught sight of the least shade of mossed green. The spade, and hoe, and fork were very useful. He showed her how to use the fork while he dug about roots with the spade and stirred the earth and let the air in. They were working industriously round one of the biggest standard roses when he caught sight of something which made him utter an exclamation of surprise. "Why," he cried, pointing to the grass a few feet away. "Who did that there?" It was one of Maria's own little clearings round the pale green points. "I did it," said Mary. "Why, I thought tha didn't know nothing about gardening," he exclaimed. "I don't," she answered, "but they were so little, and the grass was so thick and strong, and they looked as if they had no room to breathe. So I made a place for them. I don't even know what they are." Dicko went and knelt down by them, smiling his wide smile. "Tha was right," he said. "A gardener couldn't have told thee better. They'll grow now like Jack's beanstalk. They're crocuses and snowdrops, and these here is narcissuses," turning to another patch, "and here's daffodillies. Eh, they will be a sight." He ran from one clearing to another. "Tha has done a lot o' work for such a little wench," he said, looking her over. "I'm growing fatter," said Mary, "and I'm growing stronger. I used always to be tired. When I dig, I'm not tired at all. I like to smell the earth when it's turned up." "It's rare good for thee," he said, nodding his head wisely. "There's not as nice as et smell o' good clean earth, except et smell o' fresh growing things when et rain falls on 'em. I get out on et more many a day when it's rainin' and I lie under a bush and listen to et soft swish o' drops on et heather and I just sniff and sniff. My nose end fair quivers like a rabbit's, mother says." "Do you never catch cold?" inquired Mary, gazing at him wonderingly. She had never seen such a funny boy, or such a nice one. "Not me," he said, grinning. "I never catched cold since I was born. I wasn't brought up nice enough. I've chased about et more in all weathers same as et rabbits does. Mother says I've sniffed up too much fresh air for 12 years to ever get to sniffin' with cold. I'm as tough as a white thorn knobstick." He was working all the time he was talking and Mary was following him and helping him with her fork or the trowel. "There's a lot of work to do here," he said once, looking about quite exultantly. "Will you come again and help me to do it?" Mary begged. "I'm sure I can help, too. I can dig and pull up weeds, and do whatever you tell me." "Oh, do come, Dicko." "I'll come every day if tha wants me, rain or shine," he answered stoutly. "It's the best fun I ever had in my life, shut in here and wakening up a garden." "If you will come," said Mary, "if you will help me to make it alive, I don't know what I'll do," she ended helplessly. "What could you do for a boy like that?" "I'll tell thee what Thylel do," said Dicko, with his happy grin. "Thylel get fat and Thylel get as hungry as a young fox and Thylel learn how to talk to et Robin same as I do. Eh? We'll have a lot o' fun." He began to walk about, looking up in the trees and at the walls and bushes with a thoughtful expression. "I wouldn't want to make it look like a gardener's garden, all clipped and spike and span, would you?" he said. "It's nicer like this with things running wild and swingin' and catchin' hold of each other." Don't let us make it tidy, said Mary anxiously. It wouldn't seem like a secret garden if it was tidy. Dicko stood rubbing his rusty red head with a rather puzzled look. It's a secret garden, sure enough, he said, but seems like someone besides Eth Robin must have been in it since it was shut up 10 years ago. But the door was locked and the key was buried, said Mary. No one could get in. That's true, he answered. It's a queer place. Seems to me as if there would been a bit o' done here and there later than 10 years ago. But how could it have been done? Said Mary. He was examining a branch of a standard rose and he shook his head. Aye. How could it? He murmured. With that door locked and that key buried. Mistress Mary always felt that however many years she lived, she should never forget that first morning when her garden began to grow. Of course, it did seem to begin to grow for her that morning. When Dicko began to clear places to plant seeds, she remembered what Basil had sung at her when he wanted to tease her. Are there any flowers that look like bells? She inquired. Lilies o'Eth Valley does, he answered, digging away with the trowel, and there's Canterbury bells and campanulas. Let's plant some, said Mary. There's Lilies o'Eth Valley here already. I saw him. They'll have growth too close and we'll have to separate 'em, but there's plenty. Other ones takes 2 years to bloom from seed, but I can bring you some bits o' plants from our cottage garden. Why does tha want 'em? Then Mary told him about Basil and his brothers and sisters in India and of how she had hated them and of their calling her Mistress Mary quite contrary. They used to dance round and sing at me. They sang, Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells, and cockle shells, and marigolds all in a row. I just remembered it and it made me wonder if there were really flowers like silver bells. She frowned a little and gave her trowel a rather spiteful dig into the earth. I wasn't as contrary as they were. But Dicko laughed. Eh, he said, and as he crumbled the rich black soil she saw he was sniffing up the scent of it. There doesn't seem to be no need for no one to be contrary when there's flowers and such like, and such lots o' friendly wild things running about making homes for themselves, or building nests and singing and whistling, does there? Mary, kneeling by him holding the seeds, looked at him and stopped frowning. Dicko, she said, you are as nice as Martha said you were. I like you, and you make the fifth person. I never thought I should like 5 people. Dicko sat up on his heels as Martha did when she was polishing the grate. He did look funny and delightful, Mary thought, with his round blue eyes and red cheeks and happy-looking turned-up nose. Only 5 folk as tha likes, he said. Who is that other 4? Your mother and Martha. Mary checked them off on her fingers, and the Robin and Ben Weatherstaff. Dicko laughed so that he was obliged to stifle the sound by putting his arm over his mouth. I know tha thinks I'm a queer lad, he said, but I think tha art eth queerest little lass I ever saw. Then Mary did a strange thing. She leaned forward and asked him a question she had never dreamed of asking anyone before. And she tried to ask it in Yorkshire because that was his language, and in India a native was always pleased if you knew his speech. Does tha like me? She said. Eh, he answered heartily, that I does. I likes thee wonderful, and so does Eth Robin, I do believe. That's two, then, said Mary. That's two for me. And then they began to work harder than ever and more joyfully. Mary was startled and sorry when she heard the big clock in the courtyard strike the hour of her midday dinner. I shall have to go, she said mournfully. And you will have to go too, won't you? Dicko grinned. My dinner's easy to carry about with me, he said. Mother always lets me put a bit or something in my pocket. He picked up his coat from the grass and brought out of a pocket a lumpy little bundle tied up in a quite clean, coarse, blue and white handkerchief. It held two thick pieces of bread with a slice of something laid between them. It's oftenest not but bread, he said, but I've got a fine slice o' fat bacon with it today. Mary thought it looked a queer dinner, but he seemed ready to enjoy it. Run on and get thy victuals, he said. I'll be done with mine first. I'll get some more work done before I start back home. He sat down with his back against a tree. I'll call Eth Robin up, he said, and give him Eth rind o' Eth bacon to peck at. They likes a bit o' fat wonderful. Mary could scarcely bear to leave him. Suddenly it seemed as if he might be a sort of wood fairy who might be gone when she came into the garden again. He seemed too good to be true. She went slowly halfway to the door in the wall and then she stopped and went back. Whatever happens, you never would tell, she said. His poppy-colored cheeks were distended with his first big bite of bread and bacon, but he managed to smile encouragingly. If tha was a missel thrush and showed me where thy nest was, does tha think I'd tell anyone? Not me, he said. Tha art as safe as a missel thrush. And she was quite sure she was. Chapter 12. Might I have a bit of earth? Mary ran so fast that she was rather out of breath when she reached her room. Her hair was ruffled on her forehead and her cheeks were bright pink. Her dinner was waiting on the table and Martha was waiting near it. Tha's a bit late, she said. Where has Tha been? I've seen Dicko, said Mary. I've seen Dicko. I knew he'd come, said Martha exultantly. How does Tha like him? I think he's beautiful, said Mary in a determined voice. Martha looked rather taken aback, but she looked pleased, too. Well, she said, he's the best lad as ever was born, but us never thought he was handsome. His nose turns up too much. I like it to turn up, said Mary. And his eyes is so round, said Martha, a trifle doubtful. Though they're a nice color. I like them round, said Mary. And they are exactly the color of the sky over the moor. Martha beamed with satisfaction. Mother says he made 'em that color with always looking up at birds and at clouds. But he has got a big mouth, hasn't he, now? I love his big mouth, said Mary obstinately. I wish mine were just like it. Martha chuckled delightedly. It would look rare and funny in thy bit of a face, she said. But I know that would be that way when Tha saw him. How did Tha like et seeds and et garden tools? How did you know he brought them? Asked Mary. I never thought of him not bringing 'em. He'd be sure to bring 'em if they was in Yorkshire. He's such a trusty lad. Mary was afraid that she might begin to ask difficult questions, but she did not. She was very much interested in the seeds and gardening tools, and there was only one moment when Mary was frightened. This was when she began to ask where the flowers were to be planted. Who did Tha ask about it? She inquired. I haven't asked anybody yet, said Mary, hesitating. Well, I wouldn't ask Eth head gardener. He's too grand, Mr. Roach is. I've never seen him, said Mary. I've only seen under gardeners and Ben Weatherstaff. If I was you, I'd ask Ben Weatherstaff, advised Martha. He's not half as bad as he looks, for all he's so crabbed. Mr. Craven lets him do what he likes because he was here when Mrs. Craven was alive, and he used to make her laugh. She liked him. Perhaps he'd find you a corner somewhere out o' the way. If it was out of the way and no one wanted it, no one could mind my having it, could they? Mary said anxiously. There wouldn't be no reason, answered Martha. You wouldn't do no harm. Mary ate her dinner as quickly as she could, and when she rose from the table, she was going to run to her room to put on her hat again, but Martha stopped her. I've got something to tell you, she said. I thought I'd let you eat your dinner first. Mr. Craven came back this morning, and I think he wants to see you. Mary turned quite pale. Oh, she said. Why? Why? He didn't want to see me when I came. I heard Pitcher say he didn't. Well, explained Martha, Mrs. Medlock says it's because, oh mother. She was walking to Thwaite village and she met him. She'd never spoke to him before, but Mrs. Craven had been to our cottage 2 or 3 times. He'd forgot, but mother hadn't, and she made bold to stop him. I don't know what she said to him about you, but she said something as put him in mind to see you before he goes away again, tomorrow. Oh, cried Mary, is he going away tomorrow? I am so glad. He's gone for a long time. He mayn't come back till autumn or winter. He's gone to travel in foreign places. He's always done it. Oh, I'm so glad, said Mary thankfully. If he did not come back until winter, or even autumn, there would be time to watch the secret garden come alive. Even if he found out then and took it away from her, she would have had that much at least. When do you think he will want to see? She did not finish the sentence because the door opened and Mrs. Medlock walked in. She had on her best black dress and cap, and her collar was fastened with a large brooch with a picture of a man's face on it. It was a colored photograph of Mr. Medlock, who had died years ago, and she always wore it when she was dressed up. She looked nervous and excited. Your hair's rough, she said quickly. Go and brush it. Martha, help her to slip on her best dress. Mr. Craven sent me to bring her to him in his study. All the pink left Maria's cheeks. Her heart began to thump, and she felt herself changing into a stiff, plain, silent child again. She did not even answer Mrs. Medlock, but turned and walked into her bedroom, followed by Martha. She said nothing while her dress was changed and her hair brushed, and after she was quite tidy, she followed Mrs. Medlock down the corridors in silence. What was there for her to say? She was obliged to go and see Mr. Craven, and he would not like her, and she would not like him. She knew what he would think of her. She was taken to a part of the house she had not been into before. At last Mrs. Medlock knocked at a door, and when someone said, "Come in," they entered the room together. A man was sitting in an armchair before the fire, and Mrs. Medlock spoke to him. "This is Miss Mary, sir," she said. "You can go and leave her here. I will ring for you when I want you to take her away," said Mr. Craven. When she went out and closed the door, Mary could only stand waiting, a plain little thing, twisting her thin hands together. She could see that the man in the chair was not so much a hunchback as a man with high, rather crooked shoulders, and he had black hair streaked with white. He turned his head over his high shoulders and spoke to her. "Come here," he said. Mary went to him. He was not ugly. His face would have been handsome if it had not been so miserable. He looked as if the sight of her worried and fretted him, and as if he did not know what in the world to do with her. Are you well? He asked. Yes, answered Mary. Do they take good care of you? Yes. He rubbed his forehead fretfully as he looked her over. You are very thin, he said. I am getting fatter, Mary answered in what she knew was her stiffest way. What an unhappy face he had. His black eyes seemed as if they scarcely saw her, as if they were seeing something else, and he could hardly keep his thoughts upon her. I forgot you, he said. How could I remember you? I intended to send you a governess or a nurse, or someone of that sort, but I forgot. Please, began Mary. Please, and then the lump in her throat choked her. What do you want to say? He inquired. I am too big for a nurse, said Mary. And please don't make me have a governess yet. He rubbed his forehead again and stared at her. That was what the Savabai woman said, he muttered absent-mindedly. Then Mary gathered a scrap of courage. Is she Martha's mother? She stammered. Yes, I think so, he replied. She knows about children, said Mary. She has 12. She knows. He seemed to rouse himself. What do you want to do? I want to play out of doors, Mary answered, hoping that her voice did not tremble. I never liked it in India. It makes me hungry here, and I am getting fatter. He was watching her. Mrs. Savabai said it would do you good. Perhaps it will, he said. She thought you had better get stronger before you had a governess. It makes me feel strong when I play and the wine comes over the moor, argued Mary. Where do you play? He asked next. Everywhere, gasped Mary. Martha's mother sent me a skipping rope. I skip and run, and I look about to see if things are beginning to stick up out of the earth. I don't do any harm. Don't look so frightened, he said in a worried voice. You could not do any harm, a child like you. You may do what you like. Mary put her hand up to her throat because she was afraid he might see the excited lump which she felt jump into it. She came a step nearer to him. May I? She said tremulously. Her anxious little face seemed to worry him more than ever. Don't look so frightened, he exclaimed. Of course you may. I am your guardian, though I am a poor one for any child. I cannot give you time or attention. I am too ill and wretched and distracted, but I wish you to be happy and comfortable. I don't know anything about children, but Mrs. Medlock is to see that you have all you need. I sent for you today because Mrs. Savabai said I ought to see you. Her daughter had talked about you. She thought you needed fresh air and freedom and running about. She knows all about children, Mary said again in spite of herself. She ought to, said Mr. Craven. I thought her rather bold to stop me on the moor, but she said Mrs. Craven had been kind to her. It seemed hard for him to speak his dead wife's name. She is a respectable woman. Now I have seen you, I think she said sensible things. Play out of doors as much as you like. It's a big place and you may go where you like and amuse yourself as you like. Is there anything you want? As if a sudden thought had struck him. Do you want toys, books, dolls? Might I, quavered Mary, might I have a bit of earth? In her eagerness, she did not realize how queer the words would sound and that they were not the ones she had meant to say. Mr. Craven looked quite startled. Earth, he repeated. What do you mean? To plant seeds in. To make things grow, to see them come alive, Mary faltered. He gazed at her a moment and then passed his hand quickly over his eyes. Do you care about gardens so much? He said slowly. I didn't know about them in India, said Mary. I was always ill and tired, and it was too hot. I sometimes made little beds in the sand and stuck flowers in them. But here it is different. Mr. Craven got up and began to walk slowly across the room. A bit of earth, he said to himself, and Mary thought that somehow she must have reminded him of something. When he stopped and spoke to her, his dark eyes looked almost soft and kind. You can have as much earth as you want, he said. You remind me of someone else who loved the earth and things that grow. When you see a bit of earth you want, with something like a smile, take it, child, and make it come alive. May I take it from anywhere, if it's not wanted? Anywhere, he answered. There. You must go now, I am tired. He touched the bell to call Mrs. Medlock. Goodbye. I shall be away all summer. Mrs. Medlock came so quickly that Mary thought she must have been waiting in the corridor. Mrs. Medlock, Mr. Craven said to her, now I have seen the child, I understand what Mrs. Sowerby meant. She must be less delicate before she begins lessons. Give her simple, healthy food. Let her run wild in the garden. Don't look after her too much. She needs liberty and fresh air and romping about. Mrs. Sowerby is to come and see her now and then, and she may sometimes go to the cottage. Mrs. Medlock looked pleased. She was relieved to hear that she need not look after Mary too much. She had felt her a tiresome charge and had indeed seen as little of her as she dared. In addition to this, she was fond of Martha's mother. Thank you, sir, she said. Susan Sowerby and me went to school together, and she's as sensible and good-hearted a woman as you'd find in a day's walk. I never had any children myself, and she's had 12, and there never was healthier or better ones. Miss Mary can get no harm from them. I'd always take Susan Sowerby's advice about children myself. She's what you might call healthy-minded, if you understand me. I understand, Mr. Craven answered. Take Miss Mary away now and send Pitcher to me. When Mrs. Medlock left her at the end of her own corridor, Mary flew back to her room. She found Martha waiting there. Martha had, in fact, hurried back after she had removed the dinner service. I can have my garden, cried Mary. I may have it where I like. I am not going to have a governess for a long time. Your mother is coming to see me, and I may go to your cottage. He says a little girl like me could not do any harm, and I may do what I like, anywhere. Eh, said Martha delightedly. That was nice of him, wasn't it? Martha, said Mary solemnly, he is really a nice man, only his face is so miserable and his forehead is all drawn together. She ran as quickly as she could to the garden. She had been away so much longer than she had thought she should, and she knew Dicko would have to set out early on his 5-mile walk. When she slipped through the door under the ivy, she saw he was not working where she had left him. The gardening tools were laid together under a tree. She ran to them, looking all round the place, but there was no Dicko to be seen. He had gone away, and the secret garden was empty, except for the robin who had just flown across the wall and sat on a standard rosebush watching her. He's gone, she said woefully. Oh! Was he only a wood fairy? Something white fastened to the standard rosebush caught her eye. It was a piece of paper, in fact, it was a piece of the letter she had printed for Martha to send to Dicko. It was fastened on the bush with a long thorn, and in a minute she knew Dicko had left it there. There were some roughly printed letters on it and a sort of picture. At first she could not tell what it was. Then she saw it was meant for a nest with a bird sitting on it. Underneath were the printed letters and they said, I will come back. Chapter 13. I am Colin. Mary took the picture back to the house when she went to her supper and she showed it to Martha. Said Martha with great pride. I never knew our Dicko was as clever as that. That there's a picture of a missel thrush on her nest, as large as life and twice as natural. Then Mary knew Dicko had meant the picture to be a message. He had meant that she might be sure he would keep her secret. Her garden was her nest and she was like a missel thrush. Oh, how she did like that queer, common boy. She hoped he would come back the very next day and she fell asleep looking forward to the morning. But you never know what the weather will do in Yorkshire, particularly in the springtime. She was awakened in the night by the sound of rain beating with heavy drops against her window. It was pouring down in torrents and the wind was wuthering round the corners and in the chimneys of the huge old house. Mary sat up in bed and felt miserable and angry. The rain is as contrary as I ever was, she said. It came because it knew I did not want it. She threw herself back on her pillow and buried her face. She did not cry, but she lay and hated the sound of the heavily beating rain. She hated the wind and its wuthering. She could not go to sleep again. The mournful sound kept her awake because she felt mournful herself. If she had felt happy, it would probably have lulled her to sleep. How it wuthered and how the big raindrops poured down and beat against the pane. It sounds just like a person lost on the moor and wandering on and on crying, she said. She had been lying awake turning from side to side for about an hour, when suddenly something made her sit up in bed and turn her head toward the door listening. She listened and she listened. It isn't the wind now, she said in a loud whisper. That isn't the wind. It is different. It is that crying I heard before. The door of her room was ajar and the sound came down the corridor, a far-off faint sound of fretful crying. She listened for a few minutes and each minute she became more and more sure. She felt as if she must find out what it was. It seemed even stranger than the secret garden and the buried key. Perhaps the fact that she was in a rebellious mood made her bold. She put her foot out of bed and stood on the floor. I am going to find out what it is, she said. Everybody is in bed and I don't care about Mrs. Medlock. I don't care. There was a candle by her bedside and she took it up and went softly out of the room. The corridor looked very long and dark, but she was too excited to mind that. She thought she remembered the corners she must turn to find the short corridor with the door covered with tapestry, the one Mrs. Medlock had come through the day she lost herself. The sound had come up that passage. So she went on with her dim light, almost feeling her way, her heart beating so loud that she fancied she could hear it. The far faint crying went on and led her. Sometimes it stopped for a moment or so and then began again. Was this the right corner to turn? She stopped and thought. Yes, it was. Down this passage and then to the left, and then up to broad steps, and then to the right again. Yes, there was the tapestry door. She pushed it open very gently and closed it behind her, and she stood in the corridor and could hear the crying quite plainly, though it was not loud. It was on the other side of the wall at her left, and a few yards farther on there was a door. She could see a glimmer of light coming from beneath it. Someone was crying in that room, and it was quite a young someone. So she walked to the door and pushed it open, and there she was standing in the room. It was a big room with ancient, handsome furniture in it. There was a low fire glowing faintly on the hearth and a night light burning by the side of a carved four-posted bed hung with brocade, and on the bed was lying a boy, crying fretfully. Mary wondered if she was in a real place or if she had fallen asleep again and was dreaming without knowing it. The boy had a sharp, delicate face the color of ivory, and he seemed to have eyes too big for it. He had also a lot of hair which tumbled over his forehead in heavy locks and made his thin face seem smaller. He looked like a boy who had been ill, but he was crying more as if he were tired and cross than as if he were in pain. Mary stood near the door with her candle in her hand, holding her breath. Then she crept across the room, and, as she drew nearer, the light attracted the boy's attention and he turned his head on his pillow and stared at her, his grey eyes opening so wide that they seemed immense. "Who are you?" he said at last in a half-frightened whisper. "Are you a ghost?" "No, I am not," Mary answered, her own whisper sounding half-frightened. "Are you one?" He stared and stared and stared. Mary could not help noticing what strange eyes he had. They were agate grey and they looked too big for his face because they had black lashes all round them. "No," he replied after waiting a moment or so. "I am Colin." "Who is Colin?" she faltered. "I am Colin Craven." "Who are you?" "I am Mary Lennox. Mr. Craven is my uncle." "He is my father," said the boy. "Your father," gasped Mary. "No one ever told me he had a boy." "Why didn't they?" "Come here," he said, still keeping his strange eyes fixed on her with an anxious expression. She came close to the bed and he put out his hand and touched her. "You are real, aren't you?" he said. "I have such real dreams very often. You might be one of them." Mary had slipped on a woolen wrapper before she left her room and she put a piece of it between his fingers. "Rub that and see how thick and warm it is," she said. "I will pinch you a little if you like, to show you how real I am." "For a minute I thought you might be a dream too." "Where did you come from?" he asked. "From my own room. The wine withered so I couldn't go to sleep and I heard someone crying and wanted to find out who it was." "What were you crying for?" "Because I couldn't go to sleep either and my head ached." "Tell me your name again." "Mary Lennox." "Did no one ever tell you I had come to live here?" He was still fingering the fold of her wrapper, but he began to look a little more as if he believed in her reality. "No," he answered. "They daren't." "Why?" asked Mary. "Because I should have been afraid you would see me. I won't let people see me and talk me over." "Why?" Mary asked again, feeling more mystified every moment. "Because I am like this always, ill and having to lie down. My father won't let people talk me over either. The servants are not allowed to speak about me. If I live, I may be a hunchback, but I shan't live. My father hates to think I may be like him." "Oh, what a queer house this is," Mary said. "What a queer house. Everything is a kind of secret. Rooms are locked up and gardens are locked up, and you. Have you been locked up?" "No. I stay in this room because I don't want to be moved out of it. It tires me too much." "Does your father come and see you?" Mary ventured. "Sometimes. Generally when I am asleep. He doesn't want to see me." "Why?" Mary could not help asking again. A sort of angry shadow passed over the boy's face. My mother died when I was born, and it makes him wretched to look at me. He thinks I don't know, but I've heard people talking. He almost hates me. He hates the garden. Because she died, said Mary, half speaking to herself. What garden? The boy asked. Oh, just, just a garden she used to like, Mary stammered. Have you been here always? Nearly always. Sometimes I have been taken to places at the seaside, but I won't stay because people stare at me. I used to wear an iron thing to keep my back straight, but a grand doctor came from London to see me and said it was stupid. He told them to take it off and keep me out in the fresh air. I hate fresh air and I don't want to go out. I didn't when first I came here, said Mary. Why do you keep looking at me like that? Because of the dreams that are so real, he answered rather fretfully. Sometimes when I open my eyes, I don't believe I'm awake. We're both awake, said Mary. She glanced round the room with its high ceiling and shadowy corners and dim firelight. It looks quite like a dream, and it's the middle of the night, and everybody in the house is asleep, everybody but us. We are wide awake. I don't want it to be a dream, the boy said restlessly. Mary thought of something all at once. If you don't like people to see you, she began, do you want me to go away? He still held the fold of her wrapper and he gave it a little pull. No, he said. I should be sure you were a dream if you went. If you are real, sit down on that big footstool and talk. I want to hear about you. Mary put down her candle on the table near the bed and sat down on the cushioned stool. She did not want to go away at all. She wanted to stay in the mysterious hidden away room and talk to the mysterious boy. What do you want me to tell you? She said. He wanted to know how long she had been at Misselthwaite. He wanted to know which corridor her room was on. He wanted to know what she had been doing, if she disliked the moor as he disliked it, where she had lived before she came to Yorkshire. She answered all these questions and many more, and he lay back on his pillow and listened. He made her tell him a great deal about India and about her voyage across the ocean. She found out that because he had been an invalid, he had not learned things as other children had. One of his nurses had taught him to read when he was quite little, and he was always reading and looking at pictures in splendid books. Though his father rarely saw him when he was awake, he was given all sorts of wonderful things to amuse himself with. He never seemed to have been amused, however. He could have anything he asked for and was never made to do anything he did not like to do. Everyone is obliged to do what pleases me, he said indifferently. It makes me ill to be angry. No one believes I shall live to grow up. He said it as if he was so accustomed to the idea that it had ceased to matter to him at all. He seemed to like the sound of Maria's voice. As she went on talking, he listened in a drowsy, interested way. Once or twice she wondered if he were not gradually falling into a doze. But at last he asked a question which opened up a new subject. How old are you? He asked. I am 10, answered Mary, forgetting herself for the moment, and so are you. How do you know that? He demanded in a surprised voice. Because when you were born, the garden door was locked and the key was buried. And it has been locked for 10 years. Colin half sat up, turning toward her, leaning on his elbows. What garden door was locked? Who did it? Where was the key buried? He exclaimed as if he was suddenly very much interested. It was the garden Mr. Craven hates, said Mary nervously. He locked the door. No one, no one knew where he buried the key. What sort of a garden is it? Colin persisted eagerly. No one has been allowed to go into it for 10 years, was Maria's careful answer. But it was too late to be careful. He was too much like herself. He too had had nothing to think about, and the idea of a hidden garden attracted him as it had attracted her. He asked question after question. Where was it? Had she never looked for the door? Had she never asked the gardeners? They won't talk about it, said Mary. I think they have been told not to answer questions. I would make them, said Colin. Could you? Mary faltered, beginning to feel frightened. If he could make people answer questions, who knew what might happen? Everyone is obliged to please me. I told you that, he said. If I were to live, this place would sometime belong to me. They all know that. I would make them tell me. Mary had not known that she herself had been spoiled, but she could see quite plainly that this mysterious boy had been. He thought that the whole world belonged to him. How peculiar he was and how coolly he spoke of not living. Do you think you won't live? She asked, partly because she was curious and partly in hope of making him forget the garden. I don't suppose I shall, he answered as indifferently as he had spoken before. Ever since I remember anything, I have heard people say I shan't. At first they thought I was too little to understand, and now they think I don't hear. But I do. My doctor is my father's cousin. He is quite poor, and if I die, he will have all Misselthwaite when my father is dead. I should think he wouldn't want me to live. Do you want to live? Inquired Mary. No, he answered, in a cross, tired fashion. But I don't want to die. When I feel ill, I lie here and think about it until I cry and cry. I have heard you crying 3 times, Mary said, but I did not know who it was. Were you crying about that? She did so want him to forget the garden. I dare say, he answered. Let us talk about something else. Talk about that garden. Don't you want to see it? Yes, answered Mary, in quite a low voice. I do, he went on persistently. I don't think I ever really wanted to see anything before, but I want to see that garden. I want the key dug up. I want the door unlocked. I would let them take me there in my chair. That would be getting fresh air. I am going to make them open the door. He had become quite excited, and his strange eyes began to shine like stars and looked more immense than ever. They have to please me, he said. I will make them take me there and I will let you go, too. Maria's hands clutched each other. Everything would be spoiled, everything. Dicko would never come back. She would never again feel like a missel thrush with a safe hidden nest. Oh, don't do that, she cried out. He stared as if he thought she had gone crazy. Why? He exclaimed. You said you wanted to see it. I do, she answered almost with a sob in her throat. But if you make them open the door and take you in like that, it will never be a secret again. He leaned still farther forward. A secret, he said. What do you mean? Tell me. Maria's words almost tumbled over one another. You see, she panted, if no one knows but ourselves, if there was a door, hidden somewhere under the ivy, if there was, and we could find it, and if we could slip through it together and shut it behind us, and no one knew anyone was inside, and we called it our garden and pretended that we were missel thrushes and it was our nest, And if we played there almost every day and dug and planted seeds and made it all come alive? Is it dead? He interrupted her. It soon will be if no one cares for it, she went on. The bulbs will live, but the roses. He stopped her again, as excited as she was herself. What are bulbs? He put in quickly. They are daffodils and lilies and snowdrops. They are working in the earth now, pushing up pale green points because the spring is coming. Is the spring coming? He said. What is it like? You don't see it in rooms if you are ill. It is the sun shining on the rain and the rain falling on the sunshine, and things pushing up and working under the earth, said Mary. If the garden was a secret and we could get into it, we could watch the things grow bigger every day and see how many roses are alive. Don't you see? Oh, don't you see how much nicer it would be if it was a secret? He dropped back on his pillow and lay there with an odd expression on his face. I never had a secret, he said, except that one about not living to grow up. They don't know I know that, so it is a sort of secret. But I like this kind better. If you won't make them take you to the garden, pleaded Mary, perhaps. I feel almost sure I can find out how to get in sometime. And then, if the doctor wants you to go out in your chair, and if you can always do what you want to do, perhaps we might find some boy who would push you, and we could go alone and it would always be a secret garden. I should like that, he said very slowly, his eyes looking dreamy. I should like that. I should not mind fresh air in a secret garden. Mary began to recover her breath and feel safer because the idea of keeping the secret seemed to please him. She felt almost sure that if she kept on talking and could make him see the garden in his mind as she had seen it, he would like it so much that he could not bear to think that everybody might tramp into it when they chose. I'll tell you what I think it would be like if we could go into it, she said. It has been shut up so long, things have grown into a tangle perhaps. He lay quite still and listened while she went on talking about the roses which might have clambered from tree to tree and hung down, about the many birds which might have built their nests there because it was so safe. And then she told him about the robin and Ben Weatherstaff, and there was so much to tell about the robin, and it was so easy and safe to talk about it that she ceased to be afraid. The robin pleased him so much that he smiled until he looked almost beautiful, and at first Mary had thought that he was even plainer than herself, with his big eyes and heavy locks of hair. I did not know birds could be like that, he said. But if you stay in a room, you never see things. What a lot of things you know. I feel as if you had been inside that garden. She did not know what to say, so she did not say anything. He evidently did not expect an answer, and the next moment he gave her a surprise. I am going to let you look at something, he said. Do you see that rose-colored silk curtain hanging on the wall over the mantelpiece? Mary had not noticed it before, but she looked up and saw it. It was a curtain of soft silk hanging over what seemed to be some picture. Yes, she answered. There is a cord hanging from it, said Colin. Go and pull it. Mary got up, much mystified, and found the cord. When she pulled it, the silk curtain ran back on rings, and when it ran back, it uncovered a picture. It was the picture of a girl with a laughing face. She had bright hair tied up with a blue ribbon, and her gay, lovely eyes were exactly like Colin's unhappy ones, agate grey and looking twice as big as they really were because of the black lashes all round them. She is my mother, said Colin complainingly. I don't see why she died. Sometimes I hate her for doing it. How queer, said Mary. If she had lived, I believe I should not have been ill always, he grumbled. I dare say I should have lived, too. And my father would not have hated to look at me. I dare say I should have had a strong back. Draw the curtain again. Mary did as she was told and returned to her footstool. She is much prettier than you, she said, but her eyes are just like yours. At least they are the same shape and color. Why is the curtain drawn over her? He moved uncomfortably. I made them do it, he said. Sometimes I don't like to see her looking at me. She smiles too much when I am ill and miserable. Besides, she is mine and I don't want everyone to see her. There were a few moments of silence and then Mary spoke. What would Mrs. Medlock do if she found out that I had been here? She inquired. She would do as I told her to do, he answered. And I should tell her that I wanted you to come here and talk to me every day. I am glad you came. So am I, said Mary. I will come as often as I can, but, she hesitated, I shall have to look every day for the garden door. Yes, you must, said Colin, and you can tell me about it afterward. He lay thinking a few minutes, as he had done before, and then he spoke again. I think you shall be a secret, too, he said. I will not tell them until they find out. I can always send the nurse out of the room and say that I want to be by myself. Do you know Martha? Yes, I know her very well, said Mary. She waits on me. He nodded his head toward the outer corridor. She is the one who is asleep in the other room. The nurse went away yesterday to stay all night with her sister, and she always makes Martha attend to me when she wants to go out. Martha shall tell you when to come here. Then Mary understood Martha's troubled look when she had asked questions about the crying. Martha knew about you all the time, she said. Yes, she often attends to me. The nurse likes to get away from me and then Martha comes. I have been here a long time, said Mary. Shall I go away now? Your eyes look sleepy. I wish I could go to sleep before you leave me, he said rather shyly. Shut your eyes, said Mary, drawing her footstool closer, and I will do what my ayah used to do in India. I will pat your hand and stroke it and sing something quite low. I should like that perhaps, he said drowsily. Somehow she was sorry for him and did not want him to lie awake, so she leaned against the bed and began to stroke and pat his hand and sing a very low little chanting song in Hindustani. That is nice, he said more drowsily still, and she went on chanting and stroking. But when she looked at him again, his black lashes were lying close against his cheeks, for his eyes were shut and he was fast asleep. So she got up softly, took her candle and crept away without making a sound. Chapter 14. A Young Raja. The moor was hidden in mist when the morning came, and the rain had not stopped pouring down. There could be no going out of doors. Martha was so busy that Mary had no opportunity of talking to her, but in the afternoon she asked her to come and sit with her in the nursery. She came bringing the stocking she was always knitting when she was doing nothing else. What's the matter with thee? She asked as soon as they sat down. Tha looks as if tha'd something to say. I have found out what the crying was, said Mary. Martha let her knitting drop on her knee and gazed at her with startled eyes. Tha hasn't, she exclaimed. Never. I heard it in the night, Mary went on. And I got up and went to see where it came from. It was Colin. I found him. Martha's face became red with fright. Eh? Miss Mary, she said half crying. Tha shouldn't have done it, Tha shouldn't. Thai'll get me in trouble. I never told thee nothing about him, but Thai'll get me in trouble. I shall lose my place and what'll mother do? You won't lose your place, said Mary. He was glad I came. We talked and he said he was glad I came. Was he? Cried Martha. Art Tha sure? Tha doesn't know what he's like when anything vexes him. He's a big lad to cry like a baby, but when he's in a passion he'll fair scream just to frighten us. He knows us daren't call our souls our own. He wasn't vexed, said Mary. I asked him if I should go away and he made me stay. He asked me questions and I sat on a big footstool and talked to him about India and about the Robin and gardens. He wouldn't let me go. He let me see his mother's picture. Before I left him, I sang him to sleep. Martha fairly gasped with amazement. I can scarcely believe thee, she protested. It's as if Thadi walked straight into a lion's den. If he'd been like he is most times, he'd have thrown himself into one of his tantrums and roused Eth house. He won't let strangers look at him. He let me look at him. I looked at him all the time and he looked at me. We stared, said Mary. I don't know what to do, cried agitated Martha. If Mrs. Medlock finds out, she'll think I broke orders and told thee and I shall be packed back to mother. He is not going to tell Mrs. Medlock anything about it yet. It's to be a sort of secret just at first, said Mary firmly. And he says everybody is obliged to do as he pleases. Aye, that's true enough. Et bad lad, sighed Martha, wiping her forehead with her apron. He says Mrs. Medlock must. And he wants me to come and talk to him every day. And you are to tell me when he wants me. Me, said Martha, I shall lose my place, I shall for sure. You can't if you are doing what he wants you to do and everybody is ordered to obey him, Mary argued. Does Tha mean to say, cried Martha with wide open eyes, that he was nice to thee? I think he almost liked me, Mary answered. Then Tha must have bewitched him, decided Martha, drawing a long breath. Do you mean magic? Inquired Mary. I've heard about magic in India, but I can't make it. I just went into his room and I was so surprised to see him I stood and stared. And then he turned round and stared at me. And he thought I was a ghost or a dream and I thought perhaps he was. And it was so queer being there alone together in the middle of the night and not knowing about each other. And we began to ask each other questions. And when I asked him if I must go away, he said I must not. Eth world's coming to an end, gasped Martha. What is the matter with him? Asked Mary. Nobody knows for sure and certain, said Martha. Mr. Craven went off his head like when he was born. Eth doctors thought he'd have to be put in asylum. It was because Mrs. Craven died like I told you. He wouldn't set eyes on Eth baby. He just raved and said it would be another hunchback like him and it would better die. Is Colin a hunchback? Mary asked. He didn't look like one. He isn't yet, said Martha. But he began all wrong. Mother said that there was enough trouble and ragging in Eth house to set any child wrong. They was afraid his back was weak and they've always been taking care of it, keeping him lying down and not letting him walk. Once they made him wear a brace but he fretted so he was downright ill. Then a big doctor came to see him and made them take it off. He talked to Eth other doctor quite rough, in a polite way. He said there would be too much medicine and too much letting him have his own way. I think he's a very spoiled boy, said Mary. He's at worst young nowt as ever was, said Martha. I won't say as he hasn't been ill a good bit. He's had coughs and colds that's nearly killed him 2 or 3 times. Once he had rheumatic fever and once he had typhoid. A. Mrs. Medlock did get a fright then. He'd been out of his head and she was talking to nurse, thinking he didn't know nothing, and she said, he'll die this time sure enough, and best thing for him and for everybody. And she looked at him and there he was with his big eyes open, staring at her as sensible as she was herself. She didn't know WHAD happened but he just stared at her and says, you give me some water and stop talking. Do you think he will die? Asked Mary. Mother says there's no reason why any child should live that gets no fresh air and doesn't do nothing but lie on his back and read picture books and take medicine. He's weak and hates set trouble or bane taken out or doors, and he gets cold so easy he says it makes him ill. Mary sat and looked at the fire. I wonder, she said slowly, if it would not do him good to go out into a garden and watch things growing. It did me good. One of the worst fits he ever had, said Martha, was one time they took him out where the roses is by the fountain. He'd been reading in a paper about people getting something he called rose cold and he began to sneeze and said he'd got it and then a new gardener as didn't know rules passed by and looked at him curious. He threw himself into a passion and he said he'd looked at him because he was going to be a hunchback. He cried himself into a fever and was ill all night. If he ever gets angry at me, I'll never go and see him again, said Mary. He'll have thee if he wants thee, said Martha. Tha may as well know that at its start. Very soon afterward a bell rang and she rolled up her knitting. I dare say nurse wants me to stay with him a bit, she said. I hope he's in a good temper. She was out of the room about 10 minutes and then she came back with a puzzled expression. Well, Tha has bewitched him, she said. He's up on his sofa with his picture books. He's told the nurse to stay away until 6 o'clock. I'm to wait in the next room. At minute she was gone he called me to him and says, I want Mary Lennox to come and talk to me, and remember you're not to tell anyone. You'd better go as quick as you can. Mary was quite willing to go quickly. She did not want to see Colin as much as she wanted to see Dicko, but she wanted to see him very much. There was a bright fire on the hearth when she entered his room, and in the daylight she saw it was a very beautiful room indeed. There were rich colors in the rugs and hangings and pictures and books on the walls which made it look glowing and comfortable even in spite of the grey sky and falling rain. Colin looked rather like a picture himself. He was wrapped in a velvet dressing gown and Saturday against a big brocaded cushion. He had a red spot on each cheek. Come in, he said. I've been thinking about you all morning. I've been thinking about you, too, answered Mary. You don't know how frightened Martha is. She says Mrs. Medlock will think she told me about you and then she will be sent away. He frowned. Go and tell her to come here, he said. She is in the next room. Mary went and brought her back. Poor Martha was shaking in her shoes. Colin was still frowning. Have you to do what I please or have you not? He demanded. I have to do what you please, sir, Martha faltered, turning quite red. Has Medlock to do what I please? Everybody has, sir, said Martha. Well, then, if I order you to bring Miss Mary to me, how can Medlock send you away if she finds it out? Please don't let her, sir, pleaded Martha. I'll send her away if she dares to say a word about such a thing, said Master Craven grandly. She wouldn't like that, I can tell you. Thank you, sir. Bobbing a curtsy, I want to do my duty, sir. What I want is your duty, said Colin more grandly still. I'll take care of you. Now go away. When the door closed behind Martha, Colin found Mistress Mary gazing at him as if he had set her wondering. Why do you look at me like that? He asked her. What are you thinking about? I am thinking about two things. What are they? Sit down and tell me. This is the first one, said Mary, seating herself on the big stool. Once in India, I saw a boy who was a Raja. He had rubies and emeralds and diamonds stuck all over him. He spoke to his people just as you spoke to Martha. Everybody had to do everything he told them in a minute. I think they would have been killed if they hadn't. I shall make you tell me about Rajas presently, he said, but first tell me what the second thing was. I was thinking, said Mary, how different you are from Dicko. Who is Dicko? He said. What a queer name. She might as well tell him. She thought she could talk about Dicko without mentioning the secret garden. She had liked to hear Martha talk about him. Besides, she longed to talk about him. It would seem to bring him nearer. He is Martha's brother. He is 12 years old, she explained. He is not like anyone else in the world. He can charm foxes and squirrels and birds just as the natives in India charm snakes. He plays a very soft tune on a pipe and they come and listen. There were some big books on a table at his side and he dragged one suddenly toward him. There is a picture of a snake charmer in this, he exclaimed. Come and look at it. The book was a beautiful one with superb colored illustrations and he turned to one of them. Can he do that? He asked eagerly. He played on his pipe and they listened, Mary explained. But he doesn't call it magic. He says it's because he lives on the moor so much and he knows their ways. He says he feels sometimes as if he was a bird or a rabbit himself. He likes them so. I think he asked the robin questions. It seemed as if they talked to each other in soft chirps. Colin lay back on his cushion and his eyes grew larger and larger and the spots on his cheeks burned. Tell me some more about him, he said. He knows all about eggs and nests, Mary went on. And he knows where foxes and badgers and otters live. He keeps them secret so that other boys won't find their holes and frighten them. He knows about everything that grows or lives on the moor. Does he like the moor? Said Colin. How can he when it's such a great, bare, dreary place? It's the most beautiful place, protested Mary. Thousands of lovely things grow on it and there are thousands of little creatures all busy building nests and making holes and burrows and chirping or singing or squeaking to each other. They are so busy and having such fun under the earth or in the trees or heather. It's their world. How do you know all that? Said Colin, turning on his elbow to look at her. I have never been there once, really, said Mary suddenly remembering. I only drove over it in the dark. I thought it was hideous. Martha told me about it first and then Dicko. When Dicko talks about it, you feel as if you saw things and heard them and as if you were standing in the heather with the sun shining and the gorse smelling like honey and all full of bees and butterflies. You never see anything if you are ill, said Colin restlessly. He looked like a person listening to a new sound in the distance and wondering what it was. You can't if you stay in a room, said Mary. I couldn't go on the moor, he said in a resentful tone. Mary was silent for a minute and then she said something bold. You might, sometime. He moved as if he was startled. Go on the moor. How could I? I am going to die. How do you know? Said Mary unsympathetically. She didn't like the way he had of talking about dying. She did not feel very sympathetic. She felt rather as if he almost boasted about it. Oh, I've heard it ever since I remember, he answered crossly. They are always whispering about it and thinking I don't notice. They wish I would, too. Mistress Mary felt quite contrary. She pinched her lips together. If they wished I would, she said, I wouldn't. Who wishes you would? The servants, and of course Dr. Craven because he would get Misselthwaite and be rich instead of poor. He daren't say so, but he always looks cheerful when I am worse. When I had typhoid fever, his face got quite fat. I think my father wishes it, too. I don't believe he does, said Mary quite obstinately. That made Colin turn and look at her again. Don't you? He said. And then he lay back on his cushion and was still, as if he were thinking. And there was quite a long silence. Perhaps they were both of them thinking strange things children do not usually think of. I like the grand doctor from London, because he made them take the iron thing off, said Mary at last. Did he say you were going to die? No. What did he say? He didn't whisper, Colleen answered. Perhaps he knew I hated whispering. I heard him say one thing quite aloud. He said, the lad might live if he would make up his mind to it. Put him in the humor. It sounded as if he was in a temper. I'll tell you who would put you in the humor, perhaps, said Mary reflecting. She felt as if she would like this thing to be settled one way or the other. I believe Dicko would. He's always talking about live things. He never talks about dead things or things that are ill. He's always looking up in the sky to watch birds flying, or looking down at the earth to see something growing. He has such round blue eyes and they are so wide open with looking about. And he laughs such a big laugh with his wide mouth, and his cheeks are as red as cherries. She pulled her stool nearer to the sofa and her expression quite changed at the remembrance of the wide curving mouth and wide open eyes. See here, she said. Don't let us talk about dying. I don't like it. Let us talk about living. Let us talk and talk about Dicko. And then we will look at your pictures. It was the best thing she could have said. To talk about Dicko meant to talk about the moor and about the cottage and the 14 people who lived in it on 16 shillings a week, and the children who got fat on the moor grass like the wild ponies. And about Dicko's mother, and the skipping rope, and the moor with the sun on it, and about pale green points sticking up out of the black sod. And it was also alive that Mary talked more than she had ever talked before, and Colin both talked and listened as he had never done either before. And they both began to laugh over nothings as children will when they are happy together. And they laughed so that in the end they were making as much noise as if they had been two ordinary, healthy, natural 10-year-old creatures, instead of a hard, little, unloving girl and a sickly boy who believed that he was going to die. They enjoyed themselves so much that they forgot the pictures and they forgot about the time. They had been laughing quite loudly over Ben Weatherstaff and his Robin, and Colin was actually sitting up as if he had forgotten about his weak back, when he suddenly remembered something. Do you know there is one thing we have never once thought of, he said. We are cousins. It seemed so queer that they had talked so much and never remembered this simple thing that they laughed more than ever, because they had got into the humor to laugh at anything. And in the midst of the fun the door opened and in walked Dr. Craven and Mrs. Medlock. Dr. Craven started in actual alarm and Mrs. Medlock almost fell back because he had accidentally bumped against her. Good Lord! Exclaimed poor Mrs. Medlock with her eyes almost starting out of her head. Good Lord! What is this? Said Dr. Craven, coming forward. What does it mean? Then Mary was reminded of the boy Raja again. Colleen answered as if neither the doctor's alarm nor Mrs. Medlock's terror were of the slightest consequence. He was as little disturbed or frightened as if an elderly cat and dog had walked into the room. This is my cousin, Mary Lennox, he said. I asked her to come and talk to me. I like her. She must come and talk to me whenever I send for her. Dr. Craven turned reproachfully to Mrs. Medlock. Oh, sir, she panted. I don't know how it's happened. There's not a servant on the place Thadi dare to talk. They all have their orders. Nobody told her anything, said Colin. She heard me crying and found me herself. I am glad she came. Don't be silly, Medlock. Mary saw that Dr. Craven did not look pleased, but it was quite plain that he dare not oppose his patient. He sat down by Colin and felt his pulse. I am afraid there has been too much excitement. Excitement is not good for you, my boy, he said. I should be excited if she kept away, answered Colin, his eyes beginning to look dangerously sparkling. I am better. She makes me better. The nurse must bring up her tea with mine. We will have tea together. Mrs. Medlock and Dr. Craven looked at each other in a troubled way, but there was evidently nothing to be done. He does look rather better, sir, ventured Mrs. Medlock. But, thinking the matter over, he looked better this morning before she came into the room. She came into the room last night. She stayed with me a long time. She sang a Hindustani song to me and it made me go to sleep, said Colin. I was better when I wakened up. I wanted my breakfast. I want my tea now. Tell nurse, Medlock. Dr. Craven did not stay very long. He talked to the nurse for a few minutes when she came into the room and said a few words of warning to Colin. He must not talk too much. He must not forget that he was ill. He must not forget that he was very easily tired. Mary thought that there seemed to be a number of uncomfortable things he was not to forget. Colin looked fretful and kept his strange black-lashed eyes fixed on Dr. Craven's face. I want to forget it, he said at last. She makes me forget it. That is why I want her. Dr. Craven did not look happy when he left the room. He gave a puzzled glance at the little girl sitting on the large stool. She had become a stiff, silent child again as soon as he entered and he could not see what the attraction was. The boy actually did look brighter, however, and he sighed rather heavily as he went down the corridor. They are always wanting me to eat things when I don't want to, said Colin, as the nurse brought in the tea and put it on the table by the sofa. Now, if you'll eat, I will. Those muffins look so nice and hot. Tell me about Rajas. Chapter 15. Nest Building. After another week of rain, the high arch of blue sky appeared again and the sun which poured down was quite hot. Though there had been no chance to see either the secret garden or Dicko, Mistress Mary had enjoyed herself very much. The week had not seemed long. She had spent hours of every day with Colin in his room, talking about Rajas or gardens or Dicko and the cottage on the moor. They had looked at the splendid books and pictures, and sometimes Mary had read things to Colin, and sometimes he had read a little to her. When he was amused and interested, she thought he scarcely looked like an invalid at all, except that his face was so colorless and he was always on the sofa. You are a sly young one to listen and get out of your bed to go following things up like you did that night, Mrs. Medlock said once. But there's no saying it's not been a sort of blessing to the lot of us. He's not had a tantrum or a whining fit since you made friends. The nurse was just going to give up the case because she was so sick of him. But she says she doesn't mind staying now you've gone on duty with her, laughing a little. In her talks with Colin, Mary had tried to be very cautious about the secret garden. There were certain things she wanted to find out from him, but she felt that she must find them out without asking him direct questions. In the first place, as she began to like to be with him, she wanted to discover whether he was the kind of boy you could tell a secret to. He was not in the least like Dicko, but he was evidently so pleased with the idea of a garden no one knew anything about that she thought perhaps he could be trusted. But she had not known him long enough to be sure. The second thing she wanted to find out was this: if he could be trusted, if he really could, wouldn't it be possible to take him to the garden without having anyone find it out? The grand doctor had said that he must have fresh air, and Colin had said that he would not mind fresh air in a secret garden. Perhaps if he had a great deal of fresh air and knew Dicko and the robin and saw things growing, he might not think so much about dying. Mary had seen herself in the glass sometimes lately when she had realized that she looked quite a different creature from the child she had seen when she arrived from India. This child looked nicer. Even Martha had seen a change in her. "Eth hair from eth more has done thee good already," she had said. "Thaati not nigh so yellow and thaati not nigh so scrawny. Even tha hair doesn't slam down on tha head so flat. It's got some life in it so as it sticks out a bit." "It's like me," said Mary. "It's growing stronger and fatter. I'm sure there's more of it." "It looks it, for sure," said Martha, ruffling it up a little round her face. "Thaati not half so ugly when it's that way, and there's a bit o' red in tha cheeks." If gardens and fresh air had been good for her, perhaps they would be good for Colin. But then, if he hated people to look at him, perhaps he would not like to see Dicko. "Why does it make you angry when you are looked at?" she inquired one day. "I always hated it," he answered, "even when I was very little. Then when they took me to the seaside and I used to lie in my carriage, everybody used to stare and ladies would stop and talk to my nurse, and then they would begin to whisper, and I knew then they were saying I shouldn't live to grow up. Then sometimes the ladies would pat my cheeks and say, 'Poor child.' Once when a lady did that, I screamed out loud and bit her hand. She was so frightened she ran away." "She thought you had gone mad like a dog," said Mary, not at all admiringly. "I don't care what she thought," said Colin, frowning. "I wonder why you didn't scream and bite me when I came into your room," said Mary. Then she began to smile slowly. "I thought you were a ghost or a dream," he said. "You can't bite a ghost or a dream, and if you scream they don't care." "Would you hate it if a boy looked at you?" Mary asked uncertainly. He lay back on his cushion and paused thoughtfully. "There's one boy," he said quite slowly, as if he were thinking over every word. "There's one boy I believe I shouldn't mind. It's that boy who knows where the foxes live, Dicko." "I'm sure you wouldn't mind him," said Mary. "The birds don't and other animals," he said, still thinking it over. "Perhaps that's why I shouldn't. He's a sort of animal charmer and I am a boy animal." Then he laughed and she laughed too. In fact, it ended in their both laughing a great deal and finding the idea of a boy animal hiding in his hole very funny indeed. What Mary felt afterward was that she need not fear about Dicko. On that first morning when the sky was blue again, Mary wakened very early. The sun was pouring in slanting rays through the blinds, and there was something so joyous in the sight of it that she jumped out of bed and ran to the window. She drew up the blinds and opened the window itself, and a great waft of fresh, scented air blew in upon her. The moor was blue, and the whole world looked as if something magic had happened to it. There were tender little fluting sounds here and there and everywhere, as if scores of birds were beginning to tune up for a concert. Mary put her hand out of the window and held it in the sun. "It's warm, warm," she said. "It will make the green points push up and up and up, and it will make the bulbs and roots work and struggle with all their might under the earth." She kneeled down and leaned out of the window as far as she could, breathing big breaths and sniffing the air until she laughed because she remembered what Dicko's mother had said about the end of his nose quivering like a rabbit's. "It must be very early," she said. "The little clouds are all pink, and I've never seen the sky look like this. No one is up. I don't even hear the stable boys." A sudden thought made her scramble to her feet. "I can't wait. I am going to see the garden." She had learned to dress herself by this time, and she put on her clothes in 5 minutes. She knew a small side door which she could unbolt herself, and she flew downstairs in her stocking feet and put on her shoes in the hall. She unchained and unbolted and unlocked, and when the door was open, she sprang across the step with one bound, and there she was standing on the grass, which seemed to have turned green, and with the sun pouring down on her and warm, sweet wafts about her, and the fluting and twittering and singing coming from every bush and tree. She clasped her hands for pure joy and looked up in the sky, and it was so blue and pink and pearly and white and flooded with springtime light that she felt as if she must flute and sing aloud herself, and knew that thrushes and robins and skylarks could not possibly help it. She ran around the shrubs and paths towards the secret garden. "It is all different already," she said. "The grass is greener, and things are sticking up everywhere, and things are uncurling, and green buds of leaves are showing. This afternoon I am sure Dicko will come." The long warm rain had done strange things to the herbaceous beds which bordered the walk by the lower wall. There were things sprouting and pushing out from the roots of clumps of plants, and there were actually here and there glimpses of royal purple and yellow unfurling among the stems of crocuses. 6 months before, Mistress Mary would not have seen how the world was waking up, but now she missed nothing. When she had reached the place where the door hid itself under the ivy, she was startled by a curious loud sound. It was the caw of a crow, and it came from the top of the wall, and when she looked up, there sat a big glossy plumaged blue-black bird, looking down at her very wisely indeed. She had never seen a crow so close before, and he made her a little nervous. But the next moment he spread his wings and flapped away across the garden. She hoped he was not going to stay inside, and she pushed the door open, wondering if he would. When she got fairly into the garden, she saw that he probably did intend to stay, because he had alighted on a dwarf apple tree, and under the apple tree was lying a little reddish animal with a bushy tail, and both of them were watching the stooping body and rusted head of Dicko, who was kneeling on the grass working hard. Mary flew across the grass to him. "Oh, Dicko! Dicko!" she cried out. "How could you get here so early? How could you? The sun has only just got up." He got up himself, laughing and glowing, and tousled, his eyes like a bit of the sky. He said. "I was up long before him. How could I have stayed abed? World's all fair begun again this morning, it has. And it's working and hummin' and scratchin' and pippin' and nest buildin' and breathin' out sense, till you've got to be out on its steed or lying on your back. When Ed's son did jump up, Ed Moore went mad for joy, and I was in the midst of Ed Heather, and I run like mad myself, shouting and singing. And I come straight here. I couldn't have stayed away. Why, Ed Garden was lying here waiting. Mary put her hands on her chest, panting, as if she had been running herself. Oh, Dicko. Dicko, she said. I'm so happy I can scarcely breathe. Seeing him talking to a stranger, the little bushy-tailed animal rose from its place under the tree and came to him, and the rook, cawing once, flew down from its branch and settled quietly on his shoulder. This is that little fox cub, he said, rubbing the little reddish animal's head. It's named Captain. And this hare's Soot. Soot he flew across at more with me and Captain he run same as if et hounds had been after him. They both felt same as I did. Neither of the creatures looked as if he were the least afraid of Mary. When Dicko began to walk about, Soot stayed on his shoulder and Captain trotted quietly close to his side. See here, said Dicko. See how these has pushed up, and these and these. And look at these here. He threw himself upon his knees and Mary went down beside him. They had come upon a whole clump of crocuses burst into purple and orange and gold. Mary bent her face down and kissed them. You never kiss a person in that way, she said when she lifted her head. Flowers are so different. He looked puzzled but smiled. He said, I've kissed mother many a time that way when I come in from Ethmore after a day's roaming and she stood there at Eth door in Eth's sun, looking so glad and comfortable. They ran from one part of the garden to another and found so many wonders that they were obliged to remind themselves that they must whisper or speak low. He showed her swelling leaf buds on rose branches which had seemed dead. He showed her 10,000 new green points pushing through the mold. They put their eager young noses close to the earth and sniffed its warm springtime breathing. They dug and pulled and laughed low with rapture until Mistress Meyer's hair was as tumbled as Dicko's and her cheeks were almost as poppy red as his. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them came a delight more delightful than all, because it was more wonderful. Swiftly something flew across the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner, a little flare of red-breasted bird with something hanging from its beak. Dicko stood quite still and put his hand on Mary almost as if they had suddenly found themselves laughing in a church. We mun not stir, he whispered in broad Yorkshire. We mun not scarce breathe. I knowed he was Maithuntin when I seed him last. It's Ben Weatherstaff's Robin. He's buildin' his nest. He'll stay here if us don't flight him. They settled down softly upon the grass and sat there without moving. Us mustn't seem as if us was watching him too close, said Dicko. He'd be out with us for good if he got it notion us was indifferent now. He'll be a good bit different till all this is over. He's settin' up housekeeping. He'll be shyer and readier to take things in. He's got no time for visitin' and gossiping. Us must keep still a bit and try to look as if us was grass and trees and bushes. Then when he's got used to seein' us, I'll chirp a bit and he'll know us'll not be in his way. Mistress Mary was not at all sure that she knew, as Dicko seemed to, how to try to look like grass and trees and bushes. But he had said the queer thing as if it were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be quite easy to him, and indeed she watched him for a few minutes carefully, wondering if it was possible for him to quietly turn green and put out branches and leaves. But he only sat wonderfully still, and when he spoke dropped his voice to such a softness that it was curious that she could hear him, but she could. It's part o' at springtime, this nest buildin' is, he said. I warrant it's been going on in it same way every year since it world was begun. They've got their way o' thinking and doing things and a body had better not meddle. You can lose a friend in springtime easier than any other season if you're too curious. If we talk about him, I can't help looking at him, Mary said as softly as possible. We must talk of something else. There is something I want to tell you. He'll like it better if us talks or something else, said Dicko. What is it tha's got to tell me? Well, do you know about Colin? She whispered. He turned his head to look at her. What does tha know about him? He asked. I've seen him. I have been to talk to him every day this week. He wants me to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying, answered Mary. Dicko looked actually relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face. I am glad o' that, he exclaimed. I'm right down glad. It makes me easier. I know that I must say nothing about him and I don't like having to hide things. Don't you like hiding the garden? Said Mary. I'll never tell about it, he answered. But I says to Mother, I says, I got a secret to keep. It's not a bad one, tha knows that. It's no worse than hidden where a bird's nest is. Tha doesn't mind it, does tha? Mary always wanted to hear about Mother. What did she say? She asked, not at all afraid to hear. Dicko grinned sweet-temperedly. It was just like her, what she said, he answered. She gave my head a bit of a rub and laughed and she says, lad, tha can have all its secrets tha likes. I've knowed thee 12 year. How did you know about Colin? Asked Mary. Everybody as knowed about Mr. Craven knowed there was a little lad as was like to be a cripple, and they knowed Mr. Craven didn't like him to be talked about. Folks is sorry for Mr. Craven because Mrs. Craven was such a pretty young lady and they was so fond of each other. Mrs. Medlock stops in our cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite and she doesn't mind talking to Mother before us children, because she knows us has been brought up to be trusty. How did tha find out about him? Martha was in fine trouble at last time she came home. She said Thadi heard him frettin' and tha was asking questions and she didn't know what to say. Mary told him her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind which had wakened her and about the faint foul sounds of the complaining voice which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle and had ended with her opening of the door of the dimly lighted room with the carven four-posted bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dicko shook his head. Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughin', they say, he said. They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake and it's because his eyes is so like his mother's and yet looks so different in his miserable bit of a face. Do you think he wants to die? Whispered Mary. No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother, she says that's the worst thing on earth for a child. Them as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven he'd buy anything as money could buy for that poor lad, but he'd like to forget as he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him someday and find he's growed hunchback. Colin's so afraid of it himself that he won't sit up, said Mary. He says he's always thinking that if he should feel a lump coming he should go crazy and scream himself to death. He oughtn't to lie there thinking things like that, said Dicko. No lad could get well as thought them sort o' things. The fox was lying on the grass close by him, looking up to ask for a pat now and then, and Dicko bent down and rubbed his neck softly and thought a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked round the garden. When first we got in here, he said, it seemed like everything was grey. Look round now and tell me if Tha doesn't see a difference. Mary looked and caught her breath a little. Why, as she cried, the grey wall is changing. It is as if a green mist were creeping over it. It's almost like a green gauze veil. Aye, said Dicko. And it'll be greener and greener till eth grey's all gone. Can't tha guess what I was thinking? I know it was something nice, said Mary eagerly. I believe it was something about Colin. I was thinking that if he was out here, he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break on eth rose bushes, and he'd likely be healthier, explained Dicko. I was wondering if us could ever get him in eth humor to come out here and lie under eth trees in his carriage. I've been wondering that myself. I've thought of it almost every time I've talked to him, said Mary. I've wondered if he could keep a secret, and I've wondered if we could bring him here without anyone seeing us. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. The doctor said he must have fresh air, and if he wants us to take him out, no one dare disobey him. He won't go out for other people, and perhaps they will be glad if he will go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out. Dicko was thinking very hard as he scratched Captain's back. It would be good for him, I'll warrant, he said. Used he not be thinking he'd better never been born? Used he be just two children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another. Two lads and a little lass just looking on at it springtime. I warrant it would be better than doctor's stuff. He's been lying in his room so long, and he's always been so afraid of his back that it has made him queer, said Mary. He knows a good many things out of books, but he doesn't know anything else. He says he has been too ill to notice things, and he hates going out of doors and hates gardens and gardeners. But he likes to hear about this garden because it is a secret. I daren't tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it. You'll have him out here sometime for sure, said Dicko. I could push his carriage well enough. Hast thou noticed how eth Robin and his mate has been working while we've been sitting here? Look at him perched on that branch, wondering where it would be best to put that twig he's got in his beak. He made one of his low whistling calls, and the Robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly, still holding his twig. Dicko spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dicko's tone was one of friendly advice. Wherever Tha puts it, he said, it'll be all right. Tha knew how to build Tha nest before Tha came out o etheg. Get on with thee, lad. Thasn't got no time to lose. Oh, I do like to hear you talk to him, Mary said, laughing delightedly. Ben Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, and he hops about and looks as if he understood every word, and I know he likes it. Ben Weatherstaff says he is so conceited he would rather have stones thrown at him than not be noticed. Dicko laughed too and went on talking. Tha knows us won't trouble thee, he said to the Robin. Us is near Bane wild things ourselves. Us is nest buildin' too, bless thee. Look out Tha doesn't tell on us. And though the Robin did not answer, because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to his own corner of the garden, the darkness of his dewbright eye meant that he would not tell their secret for the world.